I didn't want to be here without talking about what's right in front of us, front and center today. And I think I bring a bit of a unique voice, just like some of the representatives standing up here with me today and the moms that are here, in that just like Arkansas, I come from a proud hunting state. I always look at these proposals and I say, do they hurt my Uncle Dick in his deer stand? I guess in Arkansas you might say duck blind. But we say deer stand a lot in Minnesota. We do have a lot of pheasants, a lot of things going on. And that is actually a big part of our traditions, including in my own family from northern Minnesota. And I think one of the things we've seen change politically, not just over the last 2 weeks, but over the last few years, is that more and more hunters are standing up. And they're saying, you know what? No, this isn't going to hurt my ability to hunt or my ability to safely own firearms. And I think it's very important from a Democratic Party standpoint that we make that case, because we have not been able to successfully win these battles before. And this is part of the case that we need to make. And that's one of the reasons why I thought it was important to talk about this here in Arkansas, just like I talked about it in very rural areas of Iowa, and just as I've done in my own state. And by the way, if you think you can't be for some sensible gun legislation and win, I have won every race, every place, every time. I won every rural congressional district in my state every single time I have run, including Michelle Bachmann, so that's a whole nother story. But I just think something that Denise hit on is that I think people should no longer be afraid to talk about this. We have a president that's afraid of this. He was afraid because after Parkland, he could have really made a difference and gotten that universal background check done, but he chose not to. And I'll describe that meeting that I had with him in a minute. So what have we seen the last few weeks? Well, you had already known this tragedy with the Jonesboro school shooting 21 years ago, and you also know it because you lose people every week in Arkansas due to gun violence. You have the 7th highest death rate from firearms, and of course in all those statistics, there's a person, there's a family, there's a community. And I always like to remind people of that. I remember one of our saddest shootings in the last few years was when I was senator, actually after I was DA, and it was a police officer who'd shown up at a domestic violence scene, called, just doing his job, and he shows up, and it's a man who's threatening, of course, his girlfriend, and he ends up shooting the police officer and shoots him in the head. He had body armor on, but it didn't protect him. And I was at that funeral, and I saw that mom, the widow, with her 3 kids. They had all been just in that church for a nativity play, only a week before, with the dad sitting right in the front row. And then a week later, there's that mom with this little toddler in a bright blue dress with stars on it. And I thought that moment, man, this is not just about one victim. It's about a whole family and a whole community. And we have to remember that when we take this on. So what we saw in our country is that we saw this extraordinary acts of courage. We saw ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We saw it last night in Philadelphia when those police officers somehow managed to end that without any of them dying. We saw it in El Paso when that mother protected her baby. She ends up dead, but her baby lives. We saw it in the veteran who got people out of that store. We saw it in Dayton, Ohio, where, again, the police officers show up in 1 minute, still 9 people dead because of that military-style assault weapon, but still they saved so many lives. Ordinary people, no expectation this is going to happen to them, making extraordinary decisions and showing extraordinary courage. Well, right now in Washington, D.C., we have extraordinary power. But the question is, what do you use that power to do? What do you use that power? And I think that the courage in Washington, and particularly in the Oval Office, should be matched by the courage of those ordinary people over these last few weeks. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, that means real reform. And 3 bills right now are sitting on Mitch McConnell's doorstep. Why are they sitting there? Because they actually passed the House. Because of everything that happened in 2018 and the cases that people made, just like these legislators have made, but the cases they made across the country meant that a new crop of congressmen and women came into Washington, D.C. And they said, we want to see some change. So there are 3 bills. One closes the Charleston loophole, and that was, of course, that horrendous situation where if the background check's not done in 3 days, then you automatically get a gun. People gunned down in that church because of that. The second was universal background checks, something that what we tried to pass in the Senate and came so close and wasn't able to do. The House finally did it. And the third bill that has maybe gotten a little less attention, but I think is starting to get more, was my bill that I introduced years and years ago to close what has been called the boyfriend loophole, which sounds so much more innocent than it actually is. And this is a bill which goes after stalking crimes and the ability of convicted stalkers to get a gun, and then also closes this so-called boyfriend loophole. So what this is about is that right now, under federal law, if you are convicted of a serious crime of domestic violence against your spouse, you can't go out and get a gun. But if you're convicted of the exact same crime against a girlfriend or a boyfriend victim, then you can go out and get an AK-47. That's the law. Yet, the facts are quite startling. Half of the domestic homicides in this country actually involve boyfriends and girlfriends, right, as opposed to spouses. And so that is why we want to close that. There was a conservative sheriff that testified in front of our Judiciary Committee, and he said this. He said, dangerous boyfriends can be just as scary as dangerous husbands. They hit just as hard, and they fire their guns with the same deadly force. We also know that these kinds of bills work. Convicted stalkers in about a 10-year period, convicted stalkers that when you had states that had laws in place that stopped them from getting guns, they had a 28% lower gun homicide rate for women in those states. So that's why we're trying to do that as well. So this bill passes, actually, interestingly enough, in the Violence Against Women Act as part of it. 33 Republicans voted for this in the House of Representatives. So that bill is also sitting on Mitch McConnell's doorstep because he won't even call up the Violence Against Women Act because it contains this provision. So while I would like to see additional measures, including assault weapon bans, which, by the way, has just been supported by the Republican congressman from the Dayton, Ohio area, magazine limits, as well as some of these other provisions, these bills are right there up front right now. And that's why when we get back to Washington, we're going to continue the pressure to allow for a vote on those bills. So I actually had the opportunity after Parkland to sit across from President Trump about these very issues. And that's because I had been leading this bill on domestic violence. And there's a video of this meeting, so you can all easily see it. And I sat right across from him and next to the vice president. There were about, 15 people at the table. And I told the story of our proud hunting state and why this is. I watched while 9 times the president said he wanted to pass universal background checks. He said it. I had a pen and I wrote down little hashtags of how many times he said it. He did. And so I thought, like anyone else who wants to get action, I thought, okay, after what happened in Parkland, this is a shift. And then the next day, he met with the NRA and he folded. That's what happened. And we are tired of folding on this issue because there is change. And let me say, I'll end with this. For me, this started when I was in law enforcement and we were working on reauthorizing the assault weapon ban. And I worked with our police chiefs and law enforcement all across the country. We were unsuccessful. And by the way, I thank that Philadelphia mayor for raising this last night as part of the issue. Second thing that happens I then get to the Senate, I think that's it. The moms and dads after Sandy Hook are sitting in my office the morning that that background check bill goes down, because we were trying to get the votes and whip the votes to get it done. And I had to tell them that we didn't have the votes to pass Senator Manchin and Toomey's bills. And this one mom says to me, she says, you know, my son was very severely autistic, and he had a school aide with him all the time. And every single morning before he went to school, he loved that woman. He would point to her picture on the refrigerator because he couldn't really talk. And she said, hours later, I was at that fire station. And one by one, the kids would come in. And after a while, the parents left, knew they would never see their babies alive again. And as she is sobbing in that fire station, she said she has this momentary thought of that school worker, because she said she knew that she would never leave his side. And when they found them, that woman had her arms around that little boy, and they were both shot dead. But yet that mom had the courage to come to Washington to try to advocate for change. But Washington didn't have the courage to pass that bill. What has happened since? Parkland happened. And to me, that was this major shift. There was something about those kids. They were iconic, standing and being willing. I was at that march in Washington, standing and telling their stories in the rawest ways. It didn't get immediate change, but what happened is other kids across the country started talking to mostly their dads and their grandpas. I know they did it in my state. And they said, I don't understand this. Why can't we put in some of these rules and safety rules? We can still hunt if we have these rules in place. And it changed America. That was the shift. And that's how we elected a number of these new people. So I don't see this as just some momentary tragedy that is going to change America. I see this as a march that we are on together. And we just have to remember that that same flag that hangs here in Little Rock is the same flag that hangs over El Paso and Dayton, and that there is so much more that unifies us than what divides us. And when you look at what the majority of Americans want, including hunters, the majority of Americans want to put some common sense gun safety rules in place. So let's get it done. Thank you.